A 10-year-old boy risked his life to save a girl trapped in a burning car. But when her wealthy family found out who he was, they didn't celebrate him. They wanted him gone. The air was thick, with the smell of burning rubber. 10-year-old Kamari Wade was walking home from Alcon Street, his backpack slung over one shoulder. The weight of his schoolbooks pulled him slightly to one side. The sun had dipped below the horizon, streaking the sky in deep shades of orange and purple. He had taken this route 100 times before, past the old gas station with its flickering sign, past the diner, where the waitresses called him Baby when he came in with his grandmother, past the stretch of road where the streetlights were too far apart, leaving pockets of darkness in between. Then he heard it, a deep, metallic groan, something unnatural in the stillness of the evening. Then a sharp crunch, like something heavy collapsing. Kamari stopped. His heart tapped faster. The road ahead curved around a steep hill. Beyond it, nothing but trees and silence. He took a few cautious steps forward. Then he saw it. A car, flipped on its side. Smoke curled from the hood. Its front bumper twisted against a tree. Shattered glass glimmered in the dim light, like scattered diamonds. The engine let out a low, sputtering noise, like it was struggling to stay alive. Kamari froze. Should he run for help? Should he even get closer? His grandma always warned him, "Don't get into things that aren't your business." But then he heard something else, a faint sound, barely a whisper, a voice. He dropped his backpack and ran. The car's windshield was a web of cracks, but through it he could see someone inside. A girl, maybe a little older than his sister. Her head tilted awkwardly, blood streaking down the side of her face. Her lips moved, but the sound was too weak to reach him. "Hey! Hey! Can you hear me?" Kamari shouted, pressing his hands against the broken glass. The girl stirred, a weak whimper escaping her throat. His hands were shaking, but he didn't think. He just acted. Kamari scrambled to the other side of the car, his sneakers crunching over broken glass and twisted metal. The smoke was thickening, stinging the back of his throat. The car door was crushed, its handle barely visible under the warped frame. He yanked at it. Nothing. He planted his feet and pulled harder. Still nothing. "Come on, man," he whispered, his fingers slipping against the jagged metal. Then, crackle. A sudden noise made him whip his head up. The smoke was turning darker now, rising fast. His stomach twisted. He looked back at the girl. Her eyes fluttered, barely open. He had no time. Kamari planted his foot against the wreckage and reached through the shattered window. His small arms barely fit through, jagged edges scraping against his skin. But he ignored the pain. His fingers found fabric, her sleeve. "I got you," he murmured. He pulled. She barely moved. "Help!" he screamed, his voice cutting through the trees. But the road was empty. No headlights, no voices, just him. Kamari adjusted his grip and yanked harder. The girl groaned. Her body shifted slightly. She was wedged in. He let go, panting. His mind scrambled for something. Anything. His eyes darted to the shattered windshield. Could he break it more? Could she crawl out? He snatched a loose piece of metal from the ground and slammed it against the glass. Crack! Again! Crack! One more time. Smash! On the third hit, part of the windshield caved inward. Kamari reached through, ignoring the sting of fresh cuts on his skin. His fingers found the girl's arm again. "You gotta move," he said, his voice urgent but steady. She moaned softly. Kamari pulled with everything he had. Her body shifted. He pulled again. Her torso slid forward, and then, suddenly, she tumbled out. Kamari staggered back, catching her as best he could. She was heavier than he expected. Her limbs limp, her breaths shallow. Then, a loud hissing sound. Kamari's eyes snapped up. The smoke had turned thick and black, Angry flames licked at the dashboard. The car was seconds away from going up. His arms burned from holding her up, but he forced his legs to move. One step, then another. Then he was running, dragging her with him. 10 feet, 15, 20. Then, boom! A blast of heat slammed into his back. The force knocked him forward. The ground rushed up to meet him. For a second, everything spun. Then, silence. Kamari lifted his head. The car was on fire. Flames curled around the wreckage, swallowing it whole. If he had waited even a second longer, a sharp cough made him look down. The girl. She was alive. Barely, but alive. Kamari exhaled, his chest rising and falling like he had just run a marathon. In the distance, the wail of sirens. Now, the glow of emergency lights flickering against the trees. He looked at her pale face, streaked with blood, barely holding on. She had no idea who he was, and in a few minutes, when the paramedics took her away, she probably never would. But something told Kamari this wasn't the end of the story, not even close. The flashing lights of the ambulance faded into the distance, swallowed by the night. Kamari stood there for a moment, his heartbeat still hammering in his ears, the heat from the fire still tingling against his skin. Tiny cuts on his arms stung where the glass had scraped him, his shirt damp with sweat. But there was no time to think about any of that. His grandma was waiting, and if he didn't get home soon, she'd start worrying. So he did what he always did. He picked up his backpack and kept walking. The next morning, nothing felt different. The world still moved like it always had. Cars honked, kids laughed. The smell of frying bacon drifted from Mr. Leary's corner store. The sidewalk still cracked in the same places, the same rusted chain-link fences lining the yards of houses that had seen better days. Kamari sat at the kitchen table, chewing on a piece of toast. His legs swung under the chair. Across from him, Grandma Bertie shuffled through a stack of bills, muttering under her breath. "You eat in that toast, or just holdin' it for decoration?" she asked, eyes never leaving the papers in her hand. Kamari took another bite. "I'm eatin' it." Bertie peered at him over the top of her reading glasses. "You quiet this morning." He shrugged. "Just tired." Bertie didn't ask any more questions. She just sighed, rubbing the back of her neck, then grabbed her purse from the counter. "I'm headin' to work. Walk your sister to school. And don't let me hear about you running that mouth with them boys on the block again." Kamari nodded. He was always nodding. Kamari nodded. He was always nodding. His older sister, Tiana, stomped into the kitchen, packed with all the attitude a 12-year-old could possibly fit into one body. "You better not slow me down today," she huffed, stuffing a notebook into her backpack. Kamari rolled his eyes but didn't argue. 10 minutes later. They were walking toward Hawthorne Elementary. The cracked sidewalk bounced under their sneakers. The street was alive with the usual morning sounds: dogs barking, car doors slamming, music drifting from someone's open window. Kamari knew every face in the neighborhood, every shortcut, every place to avoid, and most of the time he didn't think too much about things that weren't his business. But that day, his mind kept drifting back, to the car, the fire, the girl. What was her name? Was she okay? He shook the thoughts away and tried to focus on the present. But something told him. He hadn't seen the last of her. At school, things were the same as always. The teacher droned on about fractions. The smell of dry erase markers filled the air. Kids passed notes. The old AC unit rattled above their heads, trying its best to keep the classroom cool. Kamari sat near the window, fingers tapping against his desk. At lunch, he met up with his best friend, Terrell, near the basketball courts. Terrell took a bite of his sandwich. "What's wrong with you?" "Nothing," Kamari muttered. Terrell squinted. "You look weird, like extra weird." Kamari kicked at the dirt. You ever do something, but you don't know if you should talk about it? Tyrell frowned. No, fool. Then what? Kamari hesitated. He knew how things worked. If you weren't somebody, nobody cared. And he wasn't somebody. But last night, for just a few minutes, he had been. He sighed. Forget it. Tyrell shrugged. Suit yourself. But Kamari couldn't forget. That night, after homework and dinner, he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The whirring fan above him cast long, moving shadows across the walls, but he barely noticed. Somewhere across town, that girl was waking up in a hospital bed, and she had no idea who had saved her life. But that was about to change. Emma Caldwell opened her eyes to blinding white light. For a second, everything was a blur. Beeping machines. The steady hum of the voices outside the door. A dull ache pulsed through her body. Her head felt heavy. Her throat dry, like she hadn't spoken in days. Then, it came back. The road. The rain. The sharp jolt as the car spun out of control. Her chest tightened. She shouldn't be here. She should be. Emma. She turned her head slowly. Her mother stood at the foot of the hospital bed, hands clasped together like she had been praying in secret. Baby, do you know where you are? Emma swallowed, her voice barely a whisper. Hospital. Her mother's shoulders sagged with relief. Oh, thank God. She reached for Emma's hand. The doctor said you suffered a concussion. You have a broken rib, but, Emma, you could have died. Emma didn't need the reminder. Then, her father, Charles Caldwell, stepped into view, stoic as ever. Even now, in his tailored suit, not a strand of silver hair out of place. He looked like he had just come from a board meeting, instead of sitting by his daughter's hospital bed. Emma's voice came out hoarse. Who saved me? Her mother's brows knitted together. A boy. Young. We don't know his name yet. But the paramedics said if he hadn't pulled you out when he did, she hesitated. You wouldn't have made it. Emma blinked, trying to piece it together. She remembered flickers of movement, hands reaching for her, a voice telling her to move. But the memory was hazy, like a dream slipping away before she could hold on to it. She wanted to thank him. We need to find out who he is, she murmured. Her father sighed. Emma, let's focus on your recovery. But her mother didn't seem as dismissive. I agree. We need to know who saved our daughter's life. We owe him. Emma saw the way her father's jaw tensed. He didn't like the word owe. Let's not make this a spectacle, he said, voice even. Her mother ignored him. She turned to the nurse who had just walked in. The paramedics said the boy left before they could get his name. But someone must know who he is. The nurse hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. Emma noticed. You know something? The nurse sighed. The paramedics said he looked young, maybe 10, 11. They think he might be from... A pause, then, carefully, South Side. The room went still. Emma's mother pressed a hand to her chest. Her father's expression barely flickered. But Emma saw the shift in his eyes. South Side. That was all they needed to hear. Kamari sat at the counter of Bertie's corner store, unwrapping a pack of Now and Laters. The bell over the door jingled. He didn't look up at first. The store was always busy in the afternoons, filled with people grabbing a soda or a snack on their way home. But then, he heard it. That voice. I'm looking for a boy, about 10 years old. He would have been here last night. Kamari's chewing slowed. He turned, and there she was. A woman, standing tall, dressed too nice for a place like this, like she didn't belong here. Kamari knew that look. He'd seen it before, on teachers who thought they were saving kids like him. She hadn't noticed him yet, scanning the store like she expected him to pop out of thin air. Behind the counter, Bertie didn't look impressed. We got plenty of boys that age, she said flatly, ringing up a customer's purchase. You got a name? I don't, the woman admitted. But my daughter, Emma Caldwell, was in a car accident last night. A boy saved her. We need to find him. Silence. Kamari felt Bertie's eyes on him. He kept his head down, unwrapping another piece of candy. The woman let out a breath. Please, I just want to thank him. Bertie didn't answer right away, but Kamari already knew what she was thinking. Finally, she sighed. What do you want with him? The woman hesitated. Kamari didn't miss it. I told you, she said carefully. We owe him. Bertie looked at her, long and hard. Then she nodded toward the counter. The boy you're looking for is right there. Kamari felt the air shift as the woman turned, and just like that, for the first time, Emma Caldwell's mother was looking straight at him. Kamari met her gaze, but he didn't say a word. You're the boy who saved my daughter. Mrs. Caldwell's voice wasn't asking. It was stating a fact. Kamari didn't say anything. He just popped another piece of candy into his mouth. Bertie folded her arms. What exactly do you want with him? Mrs. Caldwell hesitated, smoothing a hand down her expensive-looking coat. I just want to talk, properly. I want to thank him. Bertie's eyes narrowed. You already said that. Silence stretched between them. Kamari could tell. Mrs. Caldwell wasn't used to being questioned. Finally, she turned back to him. Would you mind coming with me? Emma would like to see you. Kamari blinked. Emma. That was her name. He had wondered about her. But was he ready to meet her? He hadn't saved her for a reward or recognition. But now, Bertie was watching him, waiting for him to decide. He shrugged. Yeah, I guess. Mrs. Caldwell exhaled, relieved. I'll drive you. Bertie's hand shot up. Hold on, I don't know you. I don't know what you're about. Kamari's my grandson, and I'm not letting him go anywhere with just anyone. Mrs. Caldwell's expression stiffened. I can assure you, I mean him no harm. My daughter is in the hospital. I just want to give him the gratitude he deserves. Bertie didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned to Kamari. You sure about this? Kamari wasn't sure at all, but he nodded. Mrs. Caldwell led him outside to a sleek black SUV parked at the curb. The door clicked open, without her even touching it. Kamari had never been in a car like this before. The inside smelled like leather, and something expensive he couldn't name. The seats swallowed him up the second he sat down. Mrs. Caldwell pulled out her phone. As the driver pulled off, Kamari stared out the window. The streets of Southside blurred past. Corner stores, barber shops, kids playing in front yards, behind chain-link fences. But the farther they drove, the more things changed. The streets got wider. The buildings got taller. Everything looked newer. By the time they reached the hospital, Kamari felt like he had stepped into another world. Emma was propped up in her hospital bed, flipping through channels on the TV with a bored expression. Then the door opened. She turned and froze. For a second, she just stared at Kamari. Then her eyes widened. It's you! Kamari shifted, suddenly feeling awkward. He wasn't sure what he expected, but it wasn't this. You remember me? He asked. Emma nodded. Not everything, but I remember your voice. She swallowed. You told me to move. Mrs. Caldwell stepped aside, letting them have their moment. Emma exhaled, shaking her head. They told me what happened, how you saved me. Kamari shrugged. I just did what I could. Emma's eyes softened. That's not just anything. She studied him, like she was trying to figure something out. You live on South Side, don't you? Kamari stiffened. He knew what she meant. What everyone meant when they said it like that. Before he could answer, the door swung open. Mr. Caldwell walked in, and the second he saw Kamari, his expression shifted. The air in the hospital room changed. The moment Charles Caldwell walked in, His sharp eyes locked onto Kamari, scanning him, like he was an equation that didn't quite add up. The boy standing before him didn't look like someone who should have been anywhere near his daughter, let alone the reason she was still breathing. Kamari felt the weight of the man's stare, but he didn't look away. Emma was the first to speak. "Dad, this is Kamari. I know who he is." Kamari could tell by his tone. It wasn't a compliment. Mr. Caldwell stepped further into the room. His polished shoes made no sound against the pristine floor. He didn't offer a handshake. "You saved my daughter's life." It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," Kamari said, keeping his voice even. A beat of silence. Then, Mr. Caldwell exhaled sharply, slipping his hands into his pockets. "Well, that's fortunate." Emma's eyes narrowed. Fortunate? Her father didn't acknowledge her. Instead, he turned to his wife. "Why is the press asking about him?" Mrs. Caldwell tensed. "What?" "I just got a call from the Tribune," he said, irritation lacing his voice. "They want to run a story about the young hero who saved the Caldwell heiress." His gaze flickered back to Kamari. "I assume you didn't go looking for attention." Kamari frowned. "No, sir." Emma sat up straighter. "So let them write it. People should know what he did." Mr. Caldwell wasn't convinced. He turned to Kamari, studying him, like he was looking for an angle. "What do you want?" Kamari blinked. "Huh? What do you want in return?" It took Kamari a second to realize what he was really asking. Money. That's what Mr. Caldwell thought this was about. Kamari's stomach twisted, but he kept his face blank. "I don't want nothing." Mr. Caldwell's expression didn't change. Emma looked horrified. "Dad, he's not here for a payout." Her father ignored her, still staring at Kamari, waiting for a lie to slip out. Finally, he sighed. "I'll handle the press." Mrs. Caldwell frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means this doesn't become a story." His voice was clipped, final. "We don't need reporters digging into things. It's better for everyone if this stays quiet." Kamari understood exactly what that meant. Mr. Caldwell didn't want headlines saying, "Poor black kid saves rich white girl," because then people would start asking questions, and men like him didn't like questions. Emma looked like she was about to argue, but her father was already pulling out his phone, sending off a text. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, already walking toward the door. "A word, please." She hesitated, then followed. The second the door closed behind them, Emma let out a sharp breath. "God," she muttered, running a hand through her hair. "I'm so sorry." Kamari just shrugged. He had already figured out how this would go. Rich people like Mr. Caldwell didn't like being in debt, especially not to kids like him. Emma sighed. "My dad's complicated. He doesn't trust people easily." Kamari wasn't stupid. That wasn't it. Her father didn't trust people like him. But before he could say it out loud, his phone buzzed. He pulled out his old Nokia and pressed it to his ear. "Yeah." Bertie's voice was tight. "Come home. Now." Something was wrong. Kamari's stomach knotted. "I gotta go," he muttered, stepping back toward the door. Emma looked disappointed. "Wait, will I see you again?" Kamari hesitated. Then, finally, he nodded. Once. Emma smiled. Then, he was gone. The second Kamari stepped onto his street, he saw the problem. Reporters. They were everywhere. Cameras, microphones, people standing outside Bertie's shop like it was a crime scene. "Hey, kid. Are you the one who saved Emma Caldwell?" "Kamari, how does it feel to be a hero?" That word. Hero. It made his stomach turn. He pushed through the crowd, ducking into the store. The second the door shut behind him, Bertie was on him. "What did you do?" Kamari's chest tightened. "Nothing." "I didn't say nothing to nobody." Bertie exhaled, rubbing her temple. "Well, somebody did, Because now we got news vans camped out front. She looked at him, eyes serious. And you know what that means. Kamari swallowed. What does it mean? Bertie folded her arms. This ain't just about you anymore. She wasn't wrong. The media loved a feel-good story. But what happened when the cameras left? When people moved on? What would happen to him? To his family? Kamari wasn't sure, and that scared him more than anything. Kamari suddenly wasn't sure if saving that girl was the best or worst thing he'd ever done. For the next 2 days, he couldn't leave the house without a camera in his face. People he had never met before were calling him a hero. The news played his story like it was some kind of fairy tale. Brave young boy saves heiress from fiery wreck. Except Kamari wasn't living in a fairy tale. He was living in Southside, where grocery stores barely stocked fresh produce, where streetlights flickered when they weren't completely busted, where police drove slow through the neighborhood but never stopped to help. And now, suddenly, everyone cared. For how long, though? Kamari already knew the answer. Not long. Emma Caldwell hadn't stopped thinking about him. Her phone buzzed constantly. Texts from friends, all wanting the inside scoop. Her Instagram, flooded with messages from people who had never spoken to her before. But Kamari? She hadn't heard from him since the hospital. Her father had kept his word. He handled the press, just like he said he would, and now the reporters were already moving on to the next big thing. Soon, the world would forget Kamari Wade even existed, but Emma wouldn't let that happen. Kamari sat on the stoop outside Bertie's shop, head low, hoodie up. "Boy, stop sulking," Bertie muttered, sweeping the sidewalk. "You act like you got a reason to be ashamed." "I don't like all this," he grumbled. "I didn't do nothing special." Bertie stopped sweeping, looked at him, hard. "You pulled a girl out of a burning car," she said. "You did what grown men might have run from." Kamari stayed quiet. She sighed. "Listen to me. The world don't decide if you're special. You do." Before he could answer, a sleek black car pulled up. Kamari already knew who it was. The door opened, and Emma stepped out. Not her mom, not a driver, just her. She walked up to him, arms crossed against the cool breeze. "Can we talk?" Bertie smirked. "I'll be inside," she muttered, disappearing into the shop. Kamari glanced at Emma. "You're supposed to be resting." She snorted. "I've done nothing but rest." They sat in silence for a second. Then Emma reached into her pocket. "Here." She handed him a folded piece of paper. Kamari frowned. "What's this?" "My dad's lawyer wrote up a check," she muttered. "A lot of zeros. My parents think that's the only way to say thank you." Kamari's stomach turned. Emma sighed. "I told them you wouldn't take it." She wasn't wrong. Kamari didn't need their money. Money wouldn't change the way Mr. Caldwell looked at him. In that hospital room, money wouldn't stop the reporters from forgetting about him. Next week. "I don't want it," he muttered. Emma smiled. "I know." A beat of silence. Then, she pulled out a second piece of paper. "But maybe, you'll take this." Kamari raised a brow. "What is it?" "My school," Emma said. "They have a scholarship program. I asked my mom to pull some strings." Kamari stared at the paper. Full ride, everything covered. He swallowed. "Why?" Emma leaned back. "Because you didn't ask for anything. And that's why you deserve something." Kamari's fingers tightened around the paper. He had never imagined something like this. Not in a million years. And maybe this wouldn't change the world. Maybe tomorrow the news wouldn't care. Maybe his neighborhood would stay exactly the same. But this was real. Kamari exhaled. Then, finally, he smiled. Some heroes don't wear capes. Some don't ask for the spotlight. Some don't even realize they're heroes at all. But the right people see them. And sometimes That's all that matters. If you believe in doing the right thing, even when nobody's watching, don't forget to subscribe, because stories like these deserve to be told.